Started now.
Can I say a huge thanks to Ben Cooper, who's research manager for the Fabian Society. He's going to talk about what I think is a great report called Home Comforts. I hopefully Ben will persuade you to read this, and I'm sure he will. It's a relatively short report. It's worth reading beyond the executive summary. So my reading is it was like a good kind of crime novel. So I read the executive summary. I thought, well, Ben hasn't thought about this, and has he kind of considered that? And then I kind of read through, and Ben had considered this. So some great recommendations, some great research, and Ben, over to you.
Great, thank you, Andy. And you've set me a difficult task right from the off to persuade everyone to read my report. So Home Comforts is a report from the Fabian Society that looks at how do we tackle non-decent rented accommodation, so specifically focusing on private rented and social rented. We didn't look at homeowners because they face a specific set of unique challenges. And if we look at the latest data from the English Housing Survey, which was published after Home Comfort was published, we find that over 1.4 million households live in non-decent rented accommodation. That means there's roughly speaking been no change since the previous year in terms of the English Housing Survey assessment. In terms of the private rented sector, actually, there has been an increase year on year. It went up by 61,000, so that correspondingly means that social rented housing went down slightly. When we look at the sort of regional breakdown, so Yorkshire and Humber has the largest percentage of non-decent social housing, around 13%, and also the largest number of non-decent private rented housing at 31%. So we're effectively saying that a third of the private rented sector in Yorkshire and Humber is non-decent. That's a region very close to my heart because that's where I was born. In fact, this was a change, and we do see this quite often year on year, different regions taking the top spot, so to speak, in terms of non-decent rented accommodation. So we look at the previous year in which the data we used, that was the data that we used for this report. It was the East Midlands that had the largest percentage of poor quality social housing, and the North West that had the largest percentage of private rented housing. But like I say, year on year, in terms of the regional breakdowns, it does change. If we look at the absolute numbers rather than the percentages, the North West still has the largest absolute number of poor quality private rented sector housing at 152,000 households living in poor quality private rented sector accommodation, and it is London that has the largest number of substandard social rented homes at 98,000 for the region. If we go even to a different set of geography and look at rural versus urban, so a fifth of rural social rented homes are non-decent compared to 11% in town and 10% in our cities. And then when you look at the private rented sector, nearly half of private rented sector dwellings in rural areas are non-decent compared to 20% in towns and around about 20% in cities. And a lot of that is to do with the age of the properties in rural areas and the lack of energy efficiency. In terms of the barriers that the Labour government will have to face in improving rented accommodation, if we look at the private rented sector, you'll all be aware that cuts to council funding have been significant, and that's had a serious impact on the ability of councils to enforce standards. We also know that while this will change as a consequence of the Renters' Rights Bill, tenant insecurity and powerlessness in the private rented sector has been a real challenge. You are unlikely to make a complaint about the quality of your private rented sector home if the response of the landlord is to hike up your rent or kick you out with 2 months' notice. But it is fair to say that smaller landlords may struggle to understand the complex rules on quality. That doesn't excuse them for not being able to provide a decent quality private rented sector property. But it is fair to say that some of the regulations, because there are so many of them in terms of decency on housing, can be complex to navigate. In terms of the social rented sector, the big challenges, of course, you'll all be aware, the cuts to investment, capital investment under the Conservative government, but also the challenges around the social rent settlement. You know, only the Conservatives could create a 10-year rent settlement that lasts less than 1 year. It's a particularly impressive feat for them. It also means that there's, and of course, both impacted councils with their housing revenue accounts as well. The 106 or so councils that still have housing revenue accounts. There's also significant policy uncertainty, which disrupted plans to invest in stock. You know, for a large landlord, this might be a 5 or 10-year program, and if you've got constantly changing policy, it's incredibly difficult for them to navigate. And one of the big challenges that social landlords, particularly in London, of course, been trying to navigate is the building safety and the fire safety challenges around that. The other thing that is worth mentioning that I think the Labour government does recognise is complex funding pots have created really difficult challenges for social housing landlords. No guarantee that you'll get the money, makes it much harder to plan investment, and actually it creates significant waste. You know, constantly having to bid, that's a lot of staff time and a lot of capacity. Now, there's a clear business case to improving standards of rented properties, and it aligns quite clearly with the government missions and the milestones, and I'll quickly go through the main 4 that we've talked about. So cutting the cost of living, obviously that is a major priority for the Labour government. We know that poor quality homes are more expensive to run, contributing to financial insecurity. That's particularly the case, of course, around energy efficiency. Improving health outcomes, so poor quality housing makes ill health worse, increases the risk of trips and falls, which is a major contributor in terms of A&E admission, has negative impacts on mental health and leads to preventable deaths. What I found particularly interesting while doing this research is looking at the estimates on tackling non-decent housing and how much it can save our NHS and our social care system. So there's an estimate that tackling non-decent housing, and I should say this does include owner-occupier, it's not just rental accommodation, could save the NHS around £900 million a year, while the Care and Policy Evaluation Centre at the LSE estimated that tackling non-decent housing could save over £1 billion in social care costs. This is because it keeps people out of hospital, it keeps people in their homes, they don't need to go to a care home to get the support that they need. The final big 2 milestones and missions that this aligns with, so supporting educational attainment. You'll be aware that Labour has a big plan around the opportunity mission. So living in poor quality accommodation is a barrier to education for about 800,000 young people and children that live in poor quality rented accommodation. We know that housing standards and educational attainment are linked. So if you live in poor quality housing, you're less likely to do well at school. But we don't have, I think, a clear grasp as to the scale of that. And I think some organisations are starting to do some work really looking into the role of housing in terms of educational attainment. And then the final one, of course, is strengthening the economy. So the previous Renters' Rights Bill made an estimate on the hazards and within the private rented sector and its impact on the economy. And we know that England's GDP is about £300 million a year lower because of the hazards, not the full array of substandard accommodation is lower. We also know that, as you'll be aware, Labour has a big plan on tackling economic inactivity. We know that poor quality housing has an impact on economic inactivity. To a certain extent, it all is fairly logical. You know, if you don't live in a decent house, how are you going to be able to go to work? So there is a clear business case for that. I should also say there's probably a very strong political case as well. So we surveyed the public and asked them to. We presented a slightly binary choice in terms of um, do you think that the government should support investment to improve existing properties, even if it means reducing reducing the number of homes that are built, or vice versa? 66% of people supported investment to improve existing properties to meet basic housing standards, even if it means reducing the number of homes. Of course, that is a fairly binary choice, which I'll come on to in a second. In fact, and it's 15% that said that we should prioritise building more homes over improving existing ones. So the government can improve existing stock, in fact, actually should improve existing stock, particularly in social housing, because it will support a major increase in house building. So we all know that unless housing associations play their part in, we will not be able to meet the 1.5 million new homes target. So we need to support them with improving maintenance and tackling non-decent accommodation. I'll quickly go through not all of the recommendations because I want you to, of course, read the report. But we suggested that there should be a new good home standard for private rented and social homes with new requirements on floor coverings, accessibility, and preventing overheating. In terms of the private rented sector, we need to make sure that the database that the Renters' Rights Bill is an effective national landlord and agent register. We need to have accessible data around that. We also need to provide support and funding for landlords to meet new quality standard. In terms of the social rented sector, there needs to be a long-term social housing fund providing specific funding to social housing providers. We also think the government should explore a housing replacement and regeneration fund, which would look at the sort of blocks of flats and entire streets where there's plenty of non-decent accommodation. We also think there should be a 10-year rent settlement. So the government has committed to a 5-year one. We believe there should be a 10-year one. And there's loads of stuff around local authorities as well. For example, reversing permitted development rights that the Conservatives previously introduced. So I'll stop there because I want to leave something for you to read the report. But I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's great. So, from me, an initial question. So, I think one of the great things about your report is it started to kind of balance up. So, obviously, there's a focus on building 1.5 million new homes, but there's a potential to lose a lot of existing or a significant number of existing homes, particularly council homes, due to the lack of due to the lack of finance. So your report makes that case very well. What kind of traction are you getting with Angela Rayner's team on this?
I think they get the argument. Housing associations are also making the argument that unless you help housing associations meet their maintenance and improvement requirements, they won't be they won't be able to make their contribution to meeting the 1.5 million new homes target. In fact, December last year, the Home Builders Federation estimated that 17,000 affordable homes, or it might even be social homes, actually had planning permission, but they weren't built because there was no housing association able to buy them. And the reason why they weren't able to buy them is because they were having to devote finance to the maintenance and improvements of their properties. So, like I say, it is connected. If you don't help housing associations with their maintenance improvement, there's a real risk that even if you improve the generosity of the affordable homes program, money could be left on the table. and housing associations may not draw down that money to be used for affordable housing. So I think, they're interested in this. Obviously, budgets are tight. We'll see what the spending review says, but I think they get the argument and they understand the pressures that are faced by housing associations. You're on mute, Andy.
Thank you. I just wanted to test whether the number of non-decent homes might be an underestimate. So my story is that worked in council housing, we had 1,000 properties. We obsessed about trying to record the number with severe disrepair problems, and we kind of had weekly meetings to try and get on top of this. And it was hugely complicated because obviously we were repairing some properties, other properties were getting reported to us, properties that were kind of damp free in summer because it had a problem with damp and winter. So that's going on in the kind of social housing sector. But isn't there also an interest in private landlords kind of hiding the worst quality homes, particularly at the kind of bottom end of the private?
I think, the English Housing Survey is a survey, so, until we have the private rented sector database and, the requirement to show compliance with the decent home standard, we're never, no. There were also, and I've had conversations with civil servants about this. We don't know, for example, the percentage of housing in coastal areas that is non-decent because they don't provide it as part of the English Housing Survey. So we are lacking a full picture in terms of non-decency across the country. There is also an argument to say, is actually the decent home standard a useful assessment in terms of what a non-decent home is? It was, the last time it was updated, it was 2004, I think. It was the data in terms of gathering started in 2006. So we're talking 2 decades to nearly more than 2 decades in terms of data gathering, and definitely more than 2 decades in terms of the actual standard, which is why we've suggested that there needs to be a reassessment around what things should be included within the good home standard, for example, within a standard for housing, whether is a home that, and this is a particular problem for social housing, is a home without a floor covering or carpet actually a decent home? I'd argue not. Is a home in which it's owned by a landlord that refuses to put in basic accessibility and adaptability features a decent home? No, I'd argue not. And then on overheating, there is stuff around, of course, excess heat within the decent home standard, but that's not, I think, suitable for a changing climate, basically. So I think that there's two responses to that, Andy, in terms of, one, are we actually measuring in terms of the right? Are we actually getting accurate information and showing that across all different types of geographies? And then also, is actually the decent home standard the right measurement for decency in housing?
Final question from me, Ben, and then I'll throw it open to everybody. So again, back to an experience of managing council housing. So do division between the kind of older pre-war stuff without the cavity walls, and this is really about the relationship between housing and poverty. So if people were kind of fairly well off and weren't over occupying the properties and could afford to heat it, they didn't kind of have damp in the older properties. People who couldn't afford to heat it and were occupying at quite high levels had a much kind of higher prevalence of damp. And then we had the 60s, 70s stuff built generally to kind of a higher standard where there were kind of very low levels of damp that weren't kind of related to people's income levels. So I just wondered if you could say something about the interrelationship of poverty and poor housing.
Sure. So particularly in the private rented sector, that is obviously a significant connection. If you're on a low income, you're much more likely to live in poor housing. That is, I think, partly a consequence of there being a much broader array of incomes in terms of private rented housing. In social housing, of course, it is because of the sale of social housing under right to buy, predominantly a service for very low income individuals. I think there is by virtue of the fact there are fewer income levels, I guess, or there's a less of a scale of income in terms of social housing, there is less of a connection, although still a connection. Just in terms of, Andy, you obviously mentioned pre-war versus 60s and 70s. The pre-war stuff is where the main challenges around decency are for very understandable reasons. But we are facing a growing challenge of the 60s and 70s properties coming to the end of their natural life. And we need to have an answer for that while also dealing with, frankly, the answer that we should have dealt with. And the New Labour did with the Decent Homes programme, but the answer of the sort of pre-war accommodation. So yeah, so that there are connections between poverty and poor housing, and also the sort of a relationship between age and quality as well.
Okay, Ben, thanks for indulging me with my question. So I'll throw it open. Alison?
Hi. So a couple of things, Ben. Love the report.
Thank you.
As you know, partly with my sort of, tenant engagement hat on. I wonder the extent to which people who are living in poorer quality homes, whether that's in the social or the private rented sector, the extent to which they've been part of the conversation around what makes a unit into somewhere where people want to live. Because I think one of the problems with the initial Decent Homes work, as you say, 20 years ago, was it was back of a fag packet, component based. It was new kitchen, new building, roofs and all the rest of it, and we've sort of not really evolved from there. And you can have a relatively new kitchen and a relatively new roof, and the home not be particularly easy to live in for a family on a limited income or whatever. So that's a sort of plea to listen to the people who are actually living in the homes. I was reading something earlier that had just come out from the Centre for Cities today. I don't know if you saw that, which was couched in terms of anti-growth. So what are the things that are stopping people building the 1.5 million? And one of the suggestions was that we should reduce the minimum floor, size of a home from, 37 meters square or whatever down to one of the suggestions was as low as 40 meters squared, like they have in France. And it just made me think about the tension between shove anything up, build anything in order to get to the 1.5 million versus the arguments around quality. And it feels, particularly within the Labour Party, that the numbers are what matters at the moment, more than the quality, and particularly more than the quality of existing stock, whether that's social or the PRS. So it's partly about how do we make the case for the homes we already have, alongside making the case for the new homes that we need.
Great. Fantastic points, Alison. In terms of tenant engagement, absolutely they need to be at the forefront of deciding what a new decent home or good home standard is. They're the ones that are going to live in the rented accommodation. It's not up to those who don't live in rented accommodation to make all of the decisions. And of course, there should be specific consultation with particularly low income or vulnerable groups that have, or those with unique needs. I think I'd also go one step further in terms of they need to be consulted when the improvements are made, so on the ground, very practically. So we know under the previous Decent Homes programme that those housing associations that did it better had tenant engagement built right the way through. And that was when the case, when the case for the improvements was fairly easily understood by the individuals that were receiving the improvements. They were getting a new kitchen, they were getting a new bathroom. Really simple, really easy to explain. That's not the case for this next wave of improvements, particularly around energy efficiency. It is particularly difficult to communicate that. We shouldn't be communicating it in terms of the benefits around emissions and the movement to net zero, even though that's important. It's all about cutting bills and making people better off. And I think by building in tenant engagement within the next phase of improvements and tackling non-decency is more critical than the last. In terms of the minimum floor space stuff always comes up in terms of how to make it easier. I'm skeptical that it will make it easier. Even if it does make it easier, there are lots of other things that will make it easier to build and meet the 1.5 million new homes target. Is that really the right thing that we should be picking in terms of making things easier? I'm definitely of the belief that you can build 1.5 million new homes and that they can be good places to live in terms of the actual home themselves, but also more broadly around the infrastructure and the parks and the play spaces and the bus stops and all that sort of stuff. You can definitely have both. And I think it is worth saying that that is something that Labour understands, and we know that particularly the government understands it because the Great Places to Live idea is built within the golden rules for the grey belt. So there is stuff about requirements of creating more accessible green spaces. So there is an indication that they do get it. In terms of caring about quality, obviously we need to be encouraging the government to do more in terms of the quality of existing stock. Simple reality is that in 2050, 80% of the houses that are built that are standing are already here today. So we need to care about the existing stock if we want to make sure that everyone has a good home to live in, which of course is a priority for Angela Rayner and Matthew Pennycutt.
Jeff Austin, you've waited really patiently to ask your question. Can you jump in, please?
Oh yeah, sure. Hi. Oh, nice to be with you. Ben, I'm doing a little bit of thinking for the Healthy Housing Partnership and our links into the Housing Equity Network. And I'd like to sort of draw your attention to a couple of issues that have occurred to me in trying to think about these things. The first thing is that the 4.9 million homes that are now in the private rented sector, of that stock, 62% are individual landlords. And as you know, there are all those issues of evictions by landlords and then going back through various things. And economically, housing benefit is paying the rents. And the first thing that occurred to me is that the rent for that home in West Yorkshire at 7,000 a year turns out with housing benefit to be 49,000 a year. So there's some interesting economic issues here. And the sector is worth about 1.3 trillion, and obviously returns to the government through various taxes and arrangements quite a bit of cash. Currently, that sector has quite a lot of non-decent properties, an immense number in different parts of the country, outside the major metropolitan areas and sometimes inside. And the fact of the matter is that the landlords have no encouragement at this point to actually improve their properties particularly. level of inspections and so on. And we know that from the BRE research, there's about 1.4 million homes with category 1 hazards, which are the sort of thing that put people into the NHS service of my age. So we know that there's no impact there. And the thought that's occurred to me is that these assets, these houses, this 1.3 trillion worth, are obviously gradually, in quotes, losing their value because of this poor maintenance. I'm now equating decency to maintenance. And it seems to me that a straightforward policy from the government would be to CPO all those properties which are in receipt of housing benefits and do not undertake any improvements. But that, of course, as you mentioned earlier, depends on people doing surveys and finding out which ones they are, etc., and doing a bit of investigations. Do you think it's worthwhile for local authorities to pursue this approach? Because it would return a great return to the taxpayer and the ratepayer.
That's a great question, Jeff.
I think it's definitely an interesting idea, and the report does make certain recommendations which kind of align with your thinking. So, for example, we suggested that it should be much easier for councils to CPO individual properties, because even though CPO for land has been reformed and is being reformed, it is not being reformed for the purchase of buildings and properties. So it will still remain that Angela Rayner has to sign off any compulsory purchase of buildings. And we said that that should be made easier, that councils should basically be allowed to CPO within reasonable guidelines, but at least not subject to national permission. We did say for anyone and it being their only home, that actually, if it's your only home and it's the home you live in, that should be separate, of course. But if you've got second homes and additional homes, that there should be reform to that. In terms of reducing the value, I guess the one slight challenge to that I would say is, in a normal market, yes, they absolutely would be losing their value because the asset themselves is deteriorating. And if you had a sofa and it was deteriorating, it would lose its value, or any item. The problem is the value of a property, a rental property, is obviously linked to the rent. And you can still get good rent with a terrible property. And it's the same, actually, just a sidebar with commercial property. So, in fact, it's even worse in commercial property, because as long as you claim that you can get a rent of whatever, this is why high street properties are all empty, because they want to keep their rent artificially high and not have anyone in. So basically what I'm saying is the property market isn't a normal market. One of the things that would, I think, have a serious impact in terms of the value of a property is the ability to sell it on. And we suggested that there should be restrictions on selling it on to other landlords. It should be made very easy to sell on to housing associations and community groups, reasonably easy to sell on to homeowners, and then eventually basically impossible to sell to a private sector landlord, and particularly in areas of low value. That is where landlords extract profit and benefit by flipping these properties between each other. That would have a significant impact, or I would hope it would have a significant impact on property values, and therefore lower the value that councils have to pay. But it is an interesting idea. It's something that I will give more thought to, particularly around identifying those properties.
Great, thank you.
Okay, next question, please. Just jump in. Just while people are thinking, Ben, I said I was going to abuse my chair's privilege. So you suggest money for private landlords. When I read the executive summary, I thought, well, this is kind of creating perverse incentives. So landlords could run the property down and then get government cash but you've come up with quite an elegant solution to that. Do you want to just walk us through that?
Yes, I think it's worth starting saying why we settled on needing to give landlords money. So in and this is private landlord, in energy efficiency, if you want to do an energy efficiency improvement, there's a really strong case for what's called warm rents, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, that the tenant will pay additional rent to cover the cost of the improvement, but they'll be better off financially because they have lower energy bills. So that it would be paid through that. And of course, the landlord should make a contribution. So no tenant would be worse off through an energy efficiency improvement through that. The problem for decency is it only saves your life, but you can't monetize that. So you could basically raise the risk of tenants facing significant rent increases for basic improvement to their stock, and that is something that we want to avoid. Obviously, you'll all be aware of the significant rise in private sector rents year on year, and we don't want to be adding onto that. So in terms of what we proposed, we said that there should be a mixture of grants and loans. Grants would be available very much in the short term. So if you commit to doing your improvement as soon as possible, but you would only get up to the average amount. So the English Housing Survey makes an estimate on what it would take to lift a property out of non-decency for each region. So in Yorkshire and Humber, each landlord in terms of grant funding would only get the average amount, which means if you leave your property or you ended up putting your property in significant disrepair, you would still have to, you wouldn't get a grant to cover the full amount. But remembering that we want to minimise the cost of to tenants, we did say that there therefore should be a loan element, and that would be up to a higher minimum. We wouldn't allow basically unlimited lending, of course not, but it would be a much higher amount, and they would have to pay that back. But in order to get the loan, there would be a series of conditions. That could be, for example, a charge on the property, so when it is sold or inherited, the government claims the full amount of money that was loaned. That could also include, restriction on rent increases, further restrictions on eviction. So there's a series of things there that, yes, we are giving money. And I should actually say the proportion of grant to loan would reduce dramatically over, I think, 10 years, I said. So within, I think after about year 5 or 6, you're basically only getting a loan. So if you want to a certain extent, get the government to help you through a grant, you have to do your improvement as soon as possible and with various conditions. So we try to navigate that between protecting tenants, but also making sure that landlords don't unduly benefit, as you say, Andy, for, there could be a perverse incentive to allow landlords to let their properties to get even further into disrepair before improving it.
Can I have another one then?
Yeah, of course.
We a couple of years ago had Claire Donovan on this podcast, who runs the wonderful End Furniture Poverty campaign. Wonderful woman, and she's done a lot of work on not only furniture poverty more generally, but specifically on flooring, and was part of a big project that the Longley Foundation funded, ended last year, looking at flooring at point of let. And it's something that, absolutely horrifies people, particularly in the, social housing sector. People are unaware that we let properties to people coming out of street homelessness with bare floorboards. People with, women leaving domestic abuse, got a bin bag full of their possessions and nowhere for, kids are sleeping on bare floorboards. So the moral case is really easy to make, persuading I just fear that unless something like that is in a Decent Homes 2 standard, that the pushback you are going to get from social housing landlords will be massive. And I know that in Wales, the Welsh Housing Quality Standard now has flooring involved. I mean, what do you think the chances are that we will get something similar in England?
I don't know is the honest answer, and that's because the consultation is going to be towards the end of this year. So there is, there's still time to get momentum behind this, even further momentum, and to really push the government to do this. Because you're absolutely right, unless it's within Decent Home Standard 2 or a Good Home Standard or whatever they decide to call it, housing associations aren't going to do it. And I think it is worth just spending a moment looking at what they say about this. They say it's expensive. They also say that they can't keep in existing carpets because it's a risk to
Nonsense.
future It is nonsense. We're not, even if you just want to avoid the legal stuff, I don't think it's beyond the wit of a lawyer to come up with a form of words that says, you take responsibility for the carpet. But there's also stuff that I find a bit difficult to swallow around. It's personal choice. It is absolutely personal choice. But if you're coming out, as you say, for street homelessness, I don't think to a certain extent you really care what colour your carpet is. You want a carpet. And we had a story, so we did a focus group with social housing tenants, and this person had been in social housing, I think, for 4 months, and she had very young children, toddlers, and as you said, they have a tendency to fall over to toddlers. And she was shocked to learn as she opened the door that it was all concrete flooring. So she had to basically fashion floor coverings out of bin bags and nappies, I think she said, to try and give some form of protection should a toddler fall over. So I think there is absolutely a moral and a practical case in terms of improving lives, I think, you mentioned, was it Longhead who did the sort of the work on that last year? And they said that it keeps people in social housing for longer, i.e. they don't leave their tenancy there. I don't want to use the word less disruptive, but you kind of get what I mean in terms of they become more settled in their home. So there is absolutely a moral and a practical case behind this. It will likely require some funding. I don't think it'll require as much funding as the estimate suggests, because I think there is stuff that you can do on keeping old carpets through different tenancies. But there's two things that I would also sort of say to housing associations. Housing associations in Wales are doing it. Why shouldn't housing associations in England do it? But I think the more damning point is I can't think, certainly in my time, and the last time I went and did a private rented viewing where there wasn't floor covering. So if landlords in the private rented sector provide floor covering as standard, because that's what the market effectively requires them to do, there should be an expectation that social housing does it. Otherwise, we're in a weird situation where social housing is of lower quality than private rented housing. And while both should be as perfect quality as possible, I think we should at least expect social housing does better than private rented sector housing.
Yep.
Okay, chance for another question or a couple of questions. Please jump in.
Yeah. Okay. Empty housing. Obviously, in the 2-year period of an empty, we seem to have a total block on anything happening to bring the house back into use. So I've been looking at that for the Healthy Housing Partnership. So that's a substantial number of dwellings that are contained in the 2-year period. It's about 1 million, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And over 2 years, it's about, say, 280,000. Yeah. The issue for me, and I think it would be great if you could present it to government, I'll be trying to do something on this separately anyway, but I'd be very happy, Ben, if you can incorporate this in your thoughts on policy. Is that the length of time of 2 years covering supposedly mostly probate activity, I think is up for question. I think the over 2 year period has a big impact as well. And I'd start out from thinking about the neighbour issue, and I haven't worked out the economics of it yet, but perhaps you can. The estimated reduction in value of neighbouring houses to an empty property is around 10% of the value. And if we say the average value of a private home, say in the UK, is around £300,000, that means that that's a 30k loss to that individual. And I know in Scotland they think there are 4 adjoining properties, but I think that's because of their sewerage adjacent to an empty property. So the issue here is, what does one do about this huge asset, which is lying empty and unattached in any way, sometimes to suitable treasury access or rents? You get a bit of council tax out of it, but you don't get much else, and it's a very big number. It's in the billions, and I wondered if in your thinking about empty properties, you've actually looked at the exchequer side, because it also relates to Londongrad, as it's called, all the millionaires from across the world farming properties by leaving them empty and taking the market value uplift to get, accrue massive wealth. This is a disgrace. And I know that, the Mayor of London has talked about this, and I'm sure you're conscious of it. But it is an empty property issue. And my same thought applies to this context. In this context, why do we not pursue CPOing empty properties? Because this is a wasting asset when there are people who need that asset for their lives, for their family, for their jobs, for their going to school, whatever. And it's currently sitting there, and it's billion of value, which could be turned into value that's applied to human use. Sorry.
So I absolutely agree. I do recognise that even if you brought every empty home back into use, we still need to build more homes. But equally, every home that we do build, get back into use, is one less that or it adds to the total stock, and it makes things far easier. In terms of what we do about it, so Sadiq's recommendations very much mirror our recommendations that we've made in the past. So we've recommended that rather than allowing councils to double the double council tax on empty homes and on second homes, because I think second homes is also an issue that we need to be talking about, particularly in our coastal areas. So at the moment, on both, you can double. So on second homes you can double it, and then on empty homes you can increase it by more than double, but it takes 10 years to get to the maximum premium. What Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, has argued, and what we've argued, is councils should be able to have much more freedom and flexibility to increase council tax premiums on those properties. So in terms of the second homes and holiday lets, we've recommended that the council should basically be able to set a premium of whatever percent it wants. Therefore, if, to take a very extreme example, it wants to increase council tax to 1,200%, it is more than welcome to do so. It must bear the consequences, either positive or negative, for that. In terms of the empty homes premium, what we've said is that these properties, you should be able to get to the premium, because the premium can be quite substantial. I think we might be talking 500% or so. It shouldn't take 10 years to get that
No.
far because a property, there are so few that do eventually meet that, but just because a property is empty for 5 years is no less problematic than a property empty for 10 years, say, so that we should make it much easier to increase a maximum amount of council tax premium. And the other thing we have slightly explored, but not in too much detail, and others have looked at variants of this, is properties owned by people not domiciled in the UK. You mentioned that, you know, particularly in London, that is a challenge. So we've sort of looked at council tax for that. The reason for that was it was part of a project sort of looking at devolution and economic powers for council. Others suggested increasing the stamp duty on for non-resident purchasers even higher. I think there's value in doing that as well, because it will bring those empty properties that are lying use and owned by people not domiciled in the UK back into ownership. But then, of course, the other, I guess, the sort of the stick is CPO stuff. So you could reformed CPO as an empty home is unlikely to be the only home an individual owned within. There are obviously certain exceptions for that. Perhaps an individual's moved abroad perhaps have moved to the United States for a job.
Yeah.
The other one is obviously if they've gone to prison, to be completely honest. So exempting those aside, an empty home is unlikely to be the only home, and therefore could come under reform compulsory purchase powers. We do also know that a lot of councils are doing work in terms of bringing back these properties into use with the instruments that they have, but I think most would recognise that they want more powers and basically better tax raising powers in particular to do that, because it raises money as well, and they're in desperate need of money.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. Yeah, the other factor I mentioned is troubling me about how to manage it, but you probably thought of it already, which is the reduction in value of 10% to adjoining properties, and how that issue should be managed at the government policy level. Because do those individuals have any rights whatsoever over those people causing the diminution in value of their properties, given that current cost is well into the billions?
It's an interesting idea. I'm not going to commit to either way. I think it's not to go all like I'm
That's
being
all right.
taxman here, but I think it's an interesting idea. It's something that I'll definitely consider going forward about. Is say if an empty home eventually gets sold, do they have a right to access some of that money?
Yeah.
Slightly trickier, I guess, in terms of, well, maybe not slightly trickier, but in terms of if it's rented out.
Yeah.
Of course. But
Yes.
it's something that I will definitely look into.
Thank you.
So, Alistair, you've been waiting really patiently. Do you want to jump in with your contribution to the debate?
Well, I'm someone who's worked for about 22 years as a lawyer for homeless people doing legal aid work. So defending possession claims, bringing homeless appeals and things like that. There are issues. I mentioned issues with carpets because, I'm a father of an asthmatic child, and I know that there are lots of people with asthma, and going into a property with carpets would be a problem for people like that, because it is a major issue in terms of asthma. And I remember seeing that as a lawyer for homeless people, that they were complaining, and my kid's got asthma and they want me to go into this place with carpets. So I think that can be an issue. I've ceased being a legal aid lawyer some years ago because of COVID destroying the sector. and I now work as a local government lawyer. And yeah, the funding issues are chronic. I mean, the state of councils at the moment is a lot worse than you get in the media. I act for 5 different councils. Several of them are bankrupt, and the rest of them are bordering on bankruptcy. So, you know, to say we want councils to get involved in a lot more CPO work is going to be very difficult. Councils are struggling to deal with getting rid of tenants who cause problems in properties. And I mean, I think the renters reform things are going to cause serious problems. It was a lot easier to get a no-fault eviction tenant into council housing as a lawyer for no-fault eviction tenants, because you could argue they weren't intentionally homeless, whereas when they're now going to get evicted for being in rent arrears and things like that, it's going to be a lot harder. Anyway, those were just a few thoughts as a former legal aid lawyer and current council lawyer.
Great questions, Alistair. Ben?
I think in terms of the carpet point, absolutely, we shouldn't be requiring asthmatic individuals or families with asthmatic children. That's why we said floor coverings, again, I think it's not beyond in theory, if the money is provided as we've requested, it could either be carpets for those who are able to have carpets or an alternative floor covering. These things are, particularly if you're going to be making saving for a significant number of families through reusing carpet, because one estimate, I think it was like £450 million a year if you were to require carpets as part of the Decent Home Standard, because the expectation would be that every carpet would be ripped out and replaced. Even if 50% of the carpets are reused each year, you then have a significant saving, which means that for the cases that you mentioned, Alistair, you could do specific and more bespoke for that. And it is worth saying that actually housing associations, they say they do sort of grants and etc. and all that sort of stuff. All that would be gone, and they could save money there as well. So there is some saving for housing associations. In terms of the CPO, absolutely, there is a broader question about local government finance reform that this report couldn't answer, but many of our other reports do try to answer in their isolation. There is a capacity challenge, absolutely, and right across all of these things, whether it's selective licensing, compulsory purchase, checking the database, supporting tenants either in private or social rented housing, there are capacity challenges, and that will need to be thought through. The selective licensing reforms in December will help slightly with that, but not completely. That is one of the reasons why, we actually recommended increases to council tax premiums to sort of fund greater capacity in that. If certain groups of individuals don't sell their houses, it's always lovely seeing the Telegraph saying that Cornwall's second home market is being devastated by the second home premium, because that actually proves that the policy is working. So there is that, I guess, balance to be struck. And then in terms of your point about intentional homelessness, I know actually there is broader work around the sort of the cause around antisocial behaviour, and that being a concern, that actually what is antisocial behaviour to a certain extent, it is not reaching criminality in terms of criminal antisocial behaviour. I believe that the sort of level is lower than that, and therefore you could sort of be stigmatizing certain types of behaviour or unduly, or certainly having an impact that just is not criminal antisocial behaviour is basically what I mean, and therefore, you know, there are concern around that.
Ben, a final question. So, as I understand it, you're in charge of the housing team. Have I caught that the Fabians are going to be increasing the number of people in the housing team? And I just wonder where you're going to be moving to next, and where you're looking to apply influence.
So staffing decisions are made by people other than myself, but we are hoping to establish a Fabian housing centre in the summer. And that we're aiming to look at things like housing in an ageing society, potentially looking at this idea of building great places to live. So it's not just about the 1.5 million new homes, it's how do we make sure these 1.5 million new homes are good places to live, of decent size, decent quality, with access to infrastructure and green spaces. Other things that we're potentially looking at, obviously, what does London need to do in the run up to the council and the mayoral elections? Of course, we've got Scottish elections next year, and looking at some of the unique challenges within the Scottish housing market, particularly, of course, with the private rented sector reform that are different to ours. So there's a vast array of issues. You know, I'm not going to mention all of them because I'm conscious of time, but hopefully in the summer there will be news in terms of that, and I'm more than happy for people to email me their thoughts around what sort of things that we should be looking at.
And finally, Ben, you've been really generous with your time with us. Make a pitch why we should all join the Fabian Society.
It's the oldest affiliate, not to show off here, particularly with another socialist society. It is the oldest affiliate of the Labour Party, although I think there is a slight debate with Jewish Labour movement. We both affiliated on the same day, but oldest affiliate. We are very much about policy, not personalities. We want to have a debate on a vast array of issues. So it's not just about housing, it's the environment, the economy, health, social care. We've got 6,500 members right across the country. We've got vibrant local societies and sections for different demographic groups as well. So please do consider joining us. You can never be a member of too many socialist societies, I think.
And a key selling point. So Alison's just put in the chat that she's a proud member, and Alison sets a high bar for this kind of stuff. So if it's good enough for Alison, it's got to be good enough for the rest of us. So Ben, can I say a huge thanks? One, for a great report, which, as I've said, if you haven't read, please read, but also for an excellent presentation tonight. And the Labour Housing Group really look forward to a constructive partnership with the Fabians going forward. So, and thanks everyone for giving up a lovely summer's evening to come and join the debate tonight.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you all. Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Right.